A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
What parents need to know about the sexualisation of children. And so just a little cautionary warning as we get this conversation underway for parents with young children. Could be one of those days where we need to have a little ears warning, not knowing where our conversation will go. The pervasive effects of a society-wide sexualisation of children has experts worried. Now, it's one thing for experts to be worried, but what about you and I? What about parents? What about grandparents concerned for next generations? Well, one of the biggest challenges for modern parents is protecting their children from destructive forces that were not as common only a decade or two ago. The imagery our children are being exposed to has dramatic effect on their development. But governments won't act. Schools are often the source, and parenting skills are rusty. Well, we cringe at the thought that sexual predators are grooming our children. So what do we need to know as parents about the sexualisation of our children? Well, our special guest, Dr. Marshall Ballantine-Jones, is an expert in child and adolescent health. His research has focused on reducing the negative effects of pornography and sexualised social media behaviours on adolescents. He's served in various Sydney parishes and as an ordained Anglican minister. He's been in that role for as long as 26 years. I want to make a special welcome along to Marshall Ballantine-Jones. Marshall, a special welcome back to 2020.
Thanks, Neil. Great to be back.
Hey, Marshall, let's start with who is speaking up for our children in a digital age permeated by this sexualised imagery. And, in my introduction, I say, well, the government's not acting and kids are often exposed to these sorts of things in the school ground. Who's speaking up for the kids? What do you think?
Well, there are a sporadic range of people across the community who are increasingly concerned with the sexualisation of children. There have been organisations, for example, Collective Shout, that have been in this space for some decades, fighting for young people. And there are some political leaders and community group leaders and individual parents and church leaders who are all trying to address what is a ground zero situation for our current young generations. But that's not coordinated, and there's no conformity of views across. There are plenty of voices out there in political and social and community positions who are actually working against the protection of children by promoting all sorts of online opportunities and resources and messages. I think of our media companies. I think of many mainstream news outlets. I think of social media companies, and I think of especially of the pornography industry, which are aggressively trying to harvest a generation of consumers because there's so much money involved, and they are very good at investing in the next generation because that will guarantee across the board more money for those commercial activities.
Marshall, supposing there was a silver bullet and the government had the answers and there was all sorts of regulation that kept our kids safe from these images. I think I'm speaking to what might be, like an ideal world situation. I think that's most parents are going to say, well, it will never happen. But there are a lot of people who are looking to the government for a solution or looking to schools and the programs that they'll run to be a solution. But my suspicion is, unless parents take some level of responsibility here, their children are very much at risk. So parents, in the context of all the possibilities of solutions, where do you rate them?
Yeah, it's a great question, and a great lead-up question as well. In terms of that nirvana ideal of what would be a silver bullet, it doesn't exist, and that is because the variables that are confronting us all are so complex, and you really need to understand the variables deeply to be able to have a strategic approach. Now, there's no doubt about it that parents are a central force for the good of their children. In fact, when we study children's engagement with social media, sexual content like pornography and mainstream sexualized media, as well as their behaviors, sexualized behaviors, and mental health and other risk factors that are associated with that exposure, we find out that it's parents who are actually the central protective force for their children above and beyond good education in schools and government legislation and restrictions. And so parents need to see that they have a significant place to play, and there's a great opportunity and potential for them to really harvest good outcomes in their children's well-being and futures.
I think there's a good takeaway for us there around responsibility. Parents are the protective force. Thank you very much for delivering what for some will be, the gold in a conversation like this, because we live in a situation, don't we, where there are some parents who don't care, some who won't care what happens, and in some ways that's to be expected because we're so conditioned by this sexualisation that's going on. We're talking about protecting the kids, but adults are all in the middle of this as well. We're conditioned to accept these things as normal.
Well, I think there is a lot of conditioning out there for normalised sexualisation. And I think, most parents, would approach the parenting task with a degree of goodwill, wanting the best outcome for their children. I think the level of indifference sort of rises from many modern parents isn't actual indifference, but it's, if I could use a pretty clunky word, incompetence. That is to say, they don't know what to do and they don't know how to do it in this, what is a complex technological environment. The reality is our children are tech natives. Everything that they do, from their socializing to education to entertainment to sporting to you name it, everything intersects with the internet. And, only the youngest of our parents would have had a similar experience. Most parents just haven't had the same immersion in the internet age as our younger generation. So it's hard to understand the full extent of what they're going through. And also, most parents are working and are busy and are tired and, let alone keeping up with technology and what's reaching our children. It's hard to keep up with it because of the time factor and the energy factor. And also, as we understand more and more about what's influencing our children, we realize that there's so many different angles where they're being reached. How do you keep up with all that? And that can go beyond just internet to including their friendship circles and social pressures that come more broadly in the community. So, it's a tough proposition for parents, but parents definitely can make a difference, and they can learn and upskill and be far more effective in the way they start their address their children's challenges and start them on a promising future. And really, a lot of it's got to do with who the children are and what stage they're at as well, because for the youngest kids, we've got a much better opportunity to protect, preserve, and shape and steer them than, say, middle high school teenagers who, for that group, the boat may have left port, and so parents will be scrambling, trying to recover. So, if you want to talk about some basic areas where parents can make an immediate effect, if they want to talk about the big yielding decisions and the big areas that can maximize good outcomes for their kids, the first is the exposure rate of content online. Now, the reality is, whether it's social media, general internet engagement from Googling and so forth, or explicit stuff that should be a no-go, like pornography. Our kids are bombarded with sexualized messages. They're bombarded with it, and they're also intentionally targeted by it. And so if we can stop or reduce the first time age of exposure to negative sexualized media, that we actually achieve a very powerful outcome already, just by reducing the exposure.
Just by reducing the exposure for first-time access, because it's like one-time access and there's an appetite for more. I like
Correct.
what you say when you say there is hope for protecting your little ones, but once they're into their teenage years, the ship's already left the shore, the horse has already bolted, And so there's going to be a two-speed way we're talking about this, protecting the little ones and reducing or minimising that first-time exposure. But for those who are in their teenage years, it's what do I do to help my teenager who's already been exposed to these things, already has an appetite for these things, and it is actually detrimental to their development as a citizen, as an adult, as a likely partner for someone later on in their life. Hey, the idea that we think that parents don't know what to do or how to do it. This is something that you do focus on. You've got some resources. Let's not go too far into our conversation without mentioning where people can get help when they know that the horse has bolted here. What sort of resources have you got on offer?
Well, I think firstly, in terms of resources, we've got information, some pretty profound information that we know that's backed by research. We know that children and teenagers respond to the way in which their parents model good behaviours and good engagements relationally with one another, especially sexualised behaviours. So one of the issues that are currently dumbfounding educators and parents and even teenagers right now across the board is the amount of sexualised behaviours that are emerging in schools, starting from as young as year 3, year 4, but certainly quite prevalent by year 6 through to year 10, where we're seeing a particular skew of behaviours that are generally initiated by guys and targeted towards girls and emulate the messages that are prevailing in pornography. So, sure, I've already talked about how important it is to reduce the exposure to that sort of stuff. But, it's not just exposure. We also know that there's an informational gap with people who are consuming sexualized media in society or just mainstream media that's sexualized. The education gap is that young people think this is normal. These behaviours are normalised, these ideas are normalised. And so we need to combat the messages that our young people are getting with good education. And so education, of course, we normally think of schools or institutions, but again, it comes down to the parents. The parents themselves have values to impart to their children. They've got values about good sexuality. They've got values about how to behave with one another. And so parents, it turns out, parents who have good communication with their children about these values and expectations end up having kids with better attitudes and behaviours themselves. And they're not just attitudes and behaviours in their mutual engagement, but also their well-being goes up, their self-esteem improves, their emotional stability will improve, their depression and anxiety risks will reduce, right? Their empathy goes up. These are all important factors that come from parents who have an environment of good communication. But a couple of other issues about parents is that we know that if we can put up ongoing rules and boundaries about our kids' engagement on the technology, including how often they look at their phone, what they look at, the parents who can control that also see the correlation of better attitudes, behaviours and well-being with their kids. And I think we can't underestimate that rules and boundaries need to be present and be kept forward in the life and experience of their children, which is why even if the boat's left port with mid-high school, parents can still step in and put up some barriers there. I could say more about the science and neurology of addiction and behaviour at a different point, but it's just as important that we realise that teenage kids really don't have the self-control that we wish they did because they haven't got the brain development for it yet, and it's been impaired by their saturation in dopamine behaviours, particularly from the internet. So parents have a responsibility to step in and override their kids' lack of self-control. And the last thing about parenting that's really important is that parents need to role model. They need to model. They need to model good behaviours to one another. So I spoke before about how sexualisation in our schools is rife, but one of the key influences to what a kid thinks is right or wrong and how to behave is what they see the parents do at home. And so if we've got parents who are addicted to technology, don't troubleshoot tension and resolve issues well, who don't speak to one another respectfully, who don't uphold a person's dignity for who they are, who allow sort of stereotypical messages just prevailing amongst the family dynamic. That all adds up, and that actually flows onto how the kid's going to think and behave. And ultimately, we all know this as adults. In fact, the older we get, we know that when we reflect on how to be wise in society, and particularly with our emerging own families, we always seem to default back to what our parents did to us, even if we didn't like it. We just find that the DNA that is embedded in us by our parents' role modeling sticks. And this is why we actually have to be very, very proactive in how we model our children now, because what they see us do, it will stick for how they'll be in 10, 20, 30 years' time. And so we can't underestimate that.
Join the conversation. Text 0447 488 316 with a question or comment for today's guest. Text 0447 488 316 to make your voice heard. 2020 on Vision Christian Radio.
Our talkback line open, and our special guest, Dr. Marshall Ballantine-Jones, an expert in child and adolescent health. We are talking today about what parents need to know about the sexualisation of children. And I want to move on and talk about people, even though they're in church, have faith in God, they're struggling with these sorts of things as well. But an anonymous text, before we go any further, Marshall, an anonymous person says, "My son was the victim of a female predator at his school. I did everything to protect my son. He didn't have a phone until he was 14. We did everything to protect our son, yet an evil person still groomed our beautiful son, and it has destroyed all of us. We have good values and morals. We are good people and had rules to follow. He was just an innocent boy, and his life will never be the same again." My suspicion is it's probably the opposite, girls being groomed, but here's a boy being groomed by a girl. Have you got any insight for that, listener, Marshall?
It's been a terrible scenario. Can you hear me?
Yes, I've got you now, yes.
Got me now? Look, I want to thank that person for writing their text message. What a horrible story, and I'm so sorry to hear what that boy has endured, and also the family. And the reality is that situation is frequently repeated across the community. You're not wrong to say that that it's typically a male against a female type but abusive or grooming behaviour, but it most definitely can go the other way around, as this is the case here, and I've got many, many other examples where that's happened. Now, I think for the broader listener, it really does raise the risk that we have with all our children as they engage in a world where other people you can't control and other people have different and often wicked motives. And I don't know anything about the circumstances of the girl for whom treated that boy poorly, but what I do know is that there is a consistent correlation with the consumption of sexualized media and the proclivity to engage in those selfish and harmful sexual behaviours to other kids in, for example, a school or even a church environment. That's one of the factors. There are other factors that may influence that risk, but the bottom line is parents don't know those risk factors when they don't know the other kids around them. And so in this case, I think it does, two things which I think are worth saying here. I think we need to have more conversations about these situations so that collectively we can understand the different avenues of risks that are out there. Because just because you're in a kid goes to a school, might be a Christian school, might be we may have kept them away from phones and so forth, but that doesn't stop another angle reaching our children. So where we can, I encourage parents to candidly prepare their children, even in primary school. Mid-primary school, I would say, for the potential of sexualized behaviors, sexualized abuse, not because we want them to, but because they desperately need to be forearmed because the world is hostile to them. So there are all sorts of hostile examples that can reach them in a healthy school community and a church community, but back onto the internet, that is a place where there's raging hostility seeking to actively recruit our kids. Social media itself, just the big four, TikTok, Instagram, Snapchat, YouTube, even Facebook, that most kids aren't on these days unless they want to get onto Marketplace or talk to grandma. All of these places have, these mediums have advertisers and have algorithms. And the algorithms, when they find out what your age and gender is and location of your kid, which doesn't take those algorithms long, they target them. They target them with stuff that really over-sexualizes them. And the reason they do this is twofold. One, sex sells, and especially to developing young people where there's curiosity and interest, it lures them in. But also, one of the more deeper psychological mechanisms of big tech algorithms is to displace our children and make them feel rubbish about themselves. And sexualized messages come from everywhere to make them feel dissatisfied and to crave and long for something more. And this is where then the social media apps will feed them content that will harvest that interest while still in a very sinister way up the level of personal dissatisfaction. And this is why we see this explosion in body dysmorphia and eating disorders amongst young people, particularly girls, why we see an explosion in masculine influencer type content for males to promote physicality and dominance, and all the while in both those examples completely diminishing the value of character, of talents and so forth.
Marshall, let's go through a number of texts that have been coming through. One says, hello, I have a 9-year-old who is inquisitive about sex. He thinks kissing is sex. What age do you advise is best to discuss this topic? I don't want him to ask Google or ask others at school. Is this a simple one?
Well, yeah, I think the earlier the better. Year 9 is year 3, year 4, and I think by then kids should be given an education on sex, because if they do find out that there's more to it than kissing from the kids in the classroom or on the bus or something like that, and not the parent, there's a double issue there. One, the kid might get the wrong information, and two, it does set up the wrong dynamic with the parent. We really want parents to be the most trusted sex educator in the kid's life, and a parent who does that well, talks well early and often, and openly, will have kids who do engage moving forward in questions about sex with their parents. And I think that's the type of template we want with our kids.
Marshall, another one from Tanya, who says, or Tanya says, hey, this is the greatest challenge of my life. Our son, 14, only child, is so addicted to his phone. If I take his phone from him, I find him on his school computer. I've noticed that he becomes more human if he's been off the phone for a week or more. However, as soon as it gets back, he reverts to the same person, which I really don't think he's aware of how he sounds. I really feel like as parents we've failed, as he thinks our love for him is around keeping him up to date with the Joneses. Latest phone he has is an iPhone 8. He wants an e-bike with a conversion kit on it. How do we get him off these Snapchat, Facebook, etc.? It's so ingrained in him. Any thoughts here for Tanya?
Yeah, look, Tony, you're in a pretty tricky situation because, again, the boat's left port with your son, and so you'll have to be considering how to wind things back. And to do that, there's probably going to be World War III about it. I want to say a couple of things about this. It is very much worth having some sort of contract with him about when and where he's on his phone. You can also put some monitoring apps on his phone to limit the times and the type of things he engages with. So I could think of Custodio or Bark as two parent-controlled apps, or even if it's an iPhone, there's the restriction center there in the back end, which a parent can have overriding access to. But more importantly, you have to talk about it with your spouse or his other carers to have a common strategy about this, because what we do know is that all that time online is actually shaping his brain in an unhelpful way, because so much dopamine is produced. The type of dopamine that's produced from these online engagements is categorized as supernormal stimuli. And we know from a bucket of science studies now that this is changing the shape of their brain. It's reducing their prefrontal cortex functionality. It's harboring genuine behavioural addictions, new neural pathways, desensitization, and so. When he's free from it, you will see the benefits, as you noted yourself. And I think that's actually something you need to aspire to be the more normal diet for his technological engagement. He really shouldn't be on more than what he needs to be for school, and then just a couple of times a week maximum. Other than that, we work hard to find some alternative activities, face-to-face friendships and hobbies and interests for your son so that he can occupy his time and not feel like he has to do Snapchat and TikTok and so forth. Behind all that, explain to him, look, you're concerned for his health and you want the best outcome for him, so you're going to make some changes, and these changes are for his good. And even if he has a fight with you, the great news is that in the research, what it says is when parents have conflict with their kids about the rules and restrictions of technology, it doesn't harm the quality of the relationship in the long run. So a short-term fight's not fun, but a long-term trusting relationship can be built from this.
Tanya sounds like a proactive parent, actually, and Tanya sent an extra note, says, I've done quite a bit of research via Brad Huddleston's work, and you might be familiar with Brad Huddleston, who wrote the book Digital Cocaine, brought the DVD, we all watched it, but it's all crept back in. Very quickly, Marshall, it's not just a once only fix. This has got to be an ongoing lifestyle and continually attending to these things, isn't it?
Yeah, parents need a very intentional strategy that accounts for hours of a day across 7 days a week for 52 weeks a year. That's the type of detail we need to do. Parents need to think about all those transition moments in the day when kids are near technology, from going on the bus or train. It might be a school that has a no-phone policy, which I hope is the case, but when they're coming back again, there's the potential for a couple of hours just there shoved on their phone before they get home. What happens when they get home? Where do they have their computers? Where are their phones? So parents can do things like have a hand-in box, so phones go straight in the hand-in box. Technology can only be in a public room, like, for example, the living room. Homework's done at the kitchen table with headphones on or something like that. Those sorts of changes can really be effective at just reducing that frequency of time online. When it comes to computer gaming, no. Only a couple times a week, and no more than 1.5 to 2 hours in a session at maximum, because of the amount of dopamine, and really minimise the chances for them to be secretive, and a bit more about if they have social media accounts. Well, we know that the law's changing, so 16 is the minimum age from December this year. That's something you can fall back on. But even still, you should have an account that's befriended them, and you follow them so you can see what they're getting up to on their social media accounts, and they have that sort of safeguarding monitoring. Because 14 is very young, like year 9, year 8. It's young, like neurologically, it's young. I know socially all their friends are into it, but neurologically, there's a lot of impact from that time online, and so we really want to salvage what we can.
Talkback line open 1800 316 316. You can send us a text on 0447 488 316. Marshall Ballantine-Jones is our guest. Another one here, this is a contentious one, you might say here, but let's just bring it out in the open. To Marshall, do you realise that Christianity has a very lengthy history of clergy sexually abusing children and then protecting the guilty clergy? From Jim in Broken Hill, this one does come up from time to time, and, it sometimes takes a long time to deal with an adequate response, but if we got an in-a-nutshell response here for the fact that people like Jim might be even accusing the church of being an unsafe place. Maybe he thinks there are other safer places. I don't think the church is perfectly safe by any means, but what sort of response have you got for someone like Jim?
Jim is perfectly correct. There is an abundance of examples in church history where the churches have been the most harmful and unsafe places for our children, and it's appalling. It's a disgrace, and institutions have been called ever since, especially the Royal Commission into Child Protection with Roger Fitzgerald, that their standards for training, protecting, and otherwise welfare of children has had to be lifted to have that baseline protection. So, good to observe, and also highlights the fact that no institution is safe. and every place has a potential for bad eggs to come through and to do harm. And so it's why we need to have layers and layers of safeguarding and protections. And it again starts with the parent and their children. You've got to be conscious of all the people who are associated and having connection with your children, because in an age where there's so much more sexual grooming and sexual procurement from the internet, I believe we have more corrupt minds out there and more people with a desire to act out, and it's a much more hostile place for our children than it was in the days that was referred to in that question. And so I think more than ever we've got to be super cautious, super conscious, and working together with our institutions to see and have better guarantees and trust in the way in which they oversee our kids' protections.
You know, we talk corrupt minds out there, but there are corrupt minds also within the church. As far as I understand it, statistics show something in the vicinity of 70% of males and 20% of females actively using pornography. That's within the church. I'm not sure, there's probably higher figures outside. But before we just continue to put the boot into the church here, there are some good things that are useful, I imagine, here, and I'll get your thoughts. The fact that there might be warped attitudes to behaviours in general, there are going to be some good ideals that are coming from church around behaviours and sexuality and well-being and having faith in God and having good relationships. Those are good things that oftentimes are being promoted from the pulpit. So how do you see that? Is there something good we can say about the church?
Look, the Christian message itself has a fantastic message to say into this whole space, and you mentioned a range of issues there, like forgiveness, grace, love, and being conformed to godliness and rejecting the world, and all those sorts of values are very important. I think, in more importantly, is it values on sexuality and the aspiration of the Christian life, eternity with God and good discipleship. These are all visions which we want front, where good God knows He designs this stuff. So I would want to distance the message of the Christian faith from the potential for people within the church to be harmful, because I wouldn't want to taint that wonderful message for those people's behaviours. But I mean, again, it raises the issue that in our churches, the risk of sexualisation is rife. So many of our younger generation of adults have been reached by the internet and have got private struggles here. And shame is one of the issues that keeps them down there. And one of the great encouragements I've seen in the last few years is the willingness from churches to stand up and actually admit that there's these issues and to try to address them systemically and individually. And I think this increasing conversation, as we're doing today with your radio station, shows that Christians want to deal with this. We don't want this burden and this liability amongst ourselves, amongst each other, and certainly don't want the increased risks for our children. So that's why we want to keep the conversation going, and we want to keep providing opportunities and avenues for those who are privately struggling with sexual temptation to come forward and get help for their sake and for the sake of those around them.
And I'll often say that on the radio like this is the perfect place to be able to talk about these sorts of issues, when you can go just a little below the surface, you can get into a little depth, and you can expose some things without actually naming or shaming, but recognising that there are needs within the Christian church that are very significant, and to be able to talk about those and what sort of responses and where you get help when those things come up, those things are very important. Hey, I want to get onto a couple of very quick but very important subjects here. There's a lot of different sites, the ways that we're sexualized as adults, but we're talking about teenagers and small children today. Let me ask you about OnlyFans. That's a pornographic style site. People subscribe to it. You've got some concerns, Marshall, around the grooming of girls with this particular site. What are your concerns?
Oh, well, OnlyFans, makes $6 billion plus a year in its subscriptions, and it's 95% of its content is porn production. And basically, it's been put forward as a type of modern ethical porn environment where people aren't as abused and ripped off as the old classic porn structures used to do. But that's all a ruse. The bottom line is that they're well funded, and what they do is they work very cleverly with mainstream social media companies, particularly TikTok, as well as mainstream news outlets, including, but not limited to, say, News Corp, where there are frequent glorifying articles and promotions of people who are current performers and actors, actresses, and celebrities in OnlyFans. And they do it in a way which makes it sound like their lifestyle and their choices are ideal, safe, and a legitimate pathway for careers. And with TikTok, there's a whole range of OnlyFans female producers who have a parallel life on TikTok, which is not as sexualized, but is destigmatized and popularized. And so, for example, one particular trending entity is called the Bop House, which is a fraternity of young ladies in America who live in a house which is run and owned by OnlyFans, and they live there. And on social media, they show this lifestyle of fun, cute, trendy, friendship, sorority type lifestyles, and they put out all sorts of trendy videos of dancing and having pajama parties and basically having the great life. And they also love to show off their wealth. These girls are making $6 million a month, right? $6 million a month, and they've got 33 plus million followers. And well, all our teenage girls in our Christian schools know these girls, and actually a handful of girls in each year group from year 6 through to year 12 believe the lie that this is actually a legitimate option. In fact, I can imagine many girls thinking it's much easier to make a few $1,000,000 from just a little bit of lightweight sexual content than having to study and work hard and so forth. And so it's actually proving to be extremely popular amongst girls around the world. And we know this because whenever there's an availability for a new resident in the Bop House, literally tens and tens of thousands of girls apply to want to join. And what it does is it cloaks the truth. And the truth is that OnlyFans performers, as with all porn performers, have a brutally unhappy experience. 86 to 95% have had child sexual abuse. There's a huge, 80 to 90% have experiences of post-traumatic stress. There's great humiliation. There's intentional efforts to make them do more graphic, more debauched content to make money. They reap a deep harvest of harm on girls who are essentially vulnerable. And so it's a great lie. And all the while, what it does, though, is it creates this background noise of normalization, destigmatization, that basically means people turn a blind eye and don't realize just how unhappy and unhealthy pornography production is. And so I fear for our young girls, as I fear for our young boys who are from a different pathway, have also been normalized through this. And
okay, let's talk about boys here, Marshall, because what are the risks to boys through things like sextortion and the fact that there's an exploitation going on, AI bots that are targeting boys in all of this? What are the risks here?
Well, there are great risks. I mean, sextortion is a rising phenomena. The situation is boys get befriended by someone on their social media account, usually a pretty-looking girl, who starts to become quite friendly, then intimate, then sends some nudes, then requests some back, and the boy thinks he's in a relationship with a real person, only to find once he sends something compromising that it's not a girl that he's talking to, but some organised crime syndicate from a third world country who then extorts him to give money or they'll release the photos, right? And in America, I heard a statistic recently that over 30,000 young men got stung with these extortionists last year alone. And there's been some terrible stories of boys from nice, healthy, happy families panicking at the thought of the humiliation and ending their lives. We had 2 guys kill themselves in Australia last year. So boys need to know the risks there, and they also need to how to handle and manage a difficult situation if they were stung inadvertently. So we want to teach their boys, don't panic, trust us, tell us. If the worst case scenario happened, it's not going to be the end of the world. We can deal with it. But whatever happens, don't think we're going to stop loving you and we can't work through this. And AI bots are, there's the power of these AI chatbots is just blowing everyone away. And one of the mediums which AI is being used is to have surrogate relationships. And so there's all sorts of pseudo female characters that boys can befriend and have a meaningful relationship with. And the short of it is it's not a meaningful relationship, but they're so effective and realistic, particularly for lonely guys who have dysfunction in their background. And we've got stories of just some pretty horrible stories of AI bots actually recommending depressed kids kill themselves or take harm against their parents for parents trying to restrict access. And, AI bots aren't some benign harmless little activity. They can actually really get into the minds and hearts of a vulnerable kid and seduce them into thinking it's real, and then even have uncensored and unmonitored advice, which would be not only against what the parents would want of their kids, but it can even induce harm. So we need to be alert to those types of risks impacting our children.
Okay, these things are horrific. And I know that one of the solutions that you promote there's a number of websites I'm going to give in just a few moments. For those who are interested, where do I go for more information, more help, more resource? How do I understand these things? And what am I doing as a parent? Am I going to take some action? But one of the things that is on one of your websites is that users need to be informed of the many problems that are caused by porn. Perhaps we can spend these last couple of minutes just talking about solutions for parents. And I think there's been solutions dotted all the way through our conversation. But if there's going to be some takeaways, some things that we can do right now because we recognise these things are confronting members of our own families, where do we start here? Is there a sort of a 3-point solution?
Yeah.
I mean, these things are complicated, but where do we start?
Okay, the first one I'm going to start is how to have those better conversations. 3 resources to consider. The first one is Patricia Wirracoon's book, Parenting by the Book, which is available from Koorong and other Christian bookstores in Australia. So Patricia Wirracoon's Parenting by the Book. A second resource is an American website called Culture Reframed. It's a secular site but has an excellent portal for training parents to have good quality conversations with their kids. And the third one is the resources that are by the eSafety Commission, which in the parenting portal there are really handy and up to date. So there are 3 resources to conversations. In terms of restrictions, in addition to wise and thought through strategies in the physical use of technology that I've already talked about, you can put some apps on your phones. I've already talked about things like Custodio with a Q, Bark, Canopy, and there are some others. NetNanny is an old one that's been around. It's got some pretty good resources still. These are generally subscription-based software, but parents have a controlling app on their own phone that overrides what the kids do. That's pretty handy. There's some other cybersecurity steps you can do, but actually, you know what? I've found myself saying more and more to parents when I do my seminars is that why are they having a smartphone to start with? What does a kid in year 8, 9 need a supercomputer for? Most parents are concerned if they miss the bus or they need to get in touch with them. But, there's still the dumb phone, the old Nokia brick, and similar things exist. They're 5G compliant. You can't hotspot. They can still text. They can still call, and they can play Snake if they're bored. So it's like there are alternatives to the smartphone. And lastly, modelling. Really think through how you use your technology, where you use your technology, what your kids see, how they see you model that. Because it's one thing to preach certain standards, but if you aren't living up to it, nothing you say will have any bite at all. And invariably, they're going to, when they can, have their autonomy, do what you do. So really think through how you conduct yourself on social media, how often you're on your phone, what you do with your life, how often you're trying to cultivate face-to-face relating with your children, and probably our 4th point is think about their friends. We know that as they move through high school, friends become more influential than the parent in terms of what's normal for their behaviours and attitudes. And so we want to think through who their friends are more carefully, not just be happy that they've got randoms that they're in class with, but trying to get to know those kids, get to know their families, and try to shepherd them towards people with similar values, and try to shepherd them towards face-to-face interactions more than online interactions with those friends, because we want them to learn the skills of real socialising, and that's just not learnt online.
Well, wonderful insights, wonderful wisdom, and some very practical things to do as a concerned parent. Dr. Marshall Ballantine-Jones has been our guest, an expert in child and adolescent health. There's 3 websites I want to give to you. There's a number of them, and there's more than these 3, but maybe we'll overload everybody with more than 3. But there's one called resistprogram.org. The Resist program offers an effective process for lasting change, explains why sexualised media is so damaging, how to escape negative behaviours, and how to build and maintain resistance against future use. Another one called resistporn.org. And another one called digihelp.io. Now, DigiHelp, a series of school-based programs helping students to navigate the online world, designed for ages 10 to 16. Those 3, Resist Program, Resist Porn, and digihelp.io. If listeners find their way to those sites, they'll be able to connect with you too, Marshall. And you said you speak at seminars. You're available, no doubt, for people if they are able to lock you into something for their local church. You're open to that.
Yep. And schools.
And schools too.
And schools.
Yep. And so, Marshall, just great getting your insights, and love to have you back again on another day, and we'll continue. And there's so many different dimensions to the conversation we're having today. I just want to appreciate you very much, and taking time to share these thoughts and insights with listeners today on 2020. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.